The story begins with fire. Not the gentle warmth of a hearth, nor the holy fire spoken of in Sunday sermons, but a consuming blaze that stripped a household down to its bones. The Reverend's parsonage, once proud and whitewashed, stood skeletal against the Mississippi night of 1849. Its beams clawed upward like blackened fingers, as if begging the heavens for mercy that would never come. The smell lingered first. A choking stench of smoke, scorched timber, and something darker, sweet, acrid, unmistakable. The air clung heavy on the tongue, as if the land itself wanted the memory to stay. Ash drifted like pale snow, settling into hair, onto clothes, into the corners of eyes that refused to look away. From the road, townsfolk gathered in silence. Men clutched hats to their chests. Women held shawls over their mouths. Children hid behind skirts, peeking with wide, unblinking eyes. They did not speak loudly. Not here, not tonight. Their words slithered in whispers, trembling between accusation and dread. Some murmured of God's punishment, others of the devil's hand, but beneath their hushed tones was a truth unspoken. This fire was not born of chance. It was lit by hands, and those hands belonged to one who had once been whipped to the edge of death. For those who dared remember, the memory cut like glass. A man, enslaved, punished not for theft nor rebellion, but for intimacy, for trespassing. An invisible line drawn between master and slave. His body had been tied, his back opened by the lash until blood painted the dust beneath him. The Reverend had prayed aloud as the whip cracked, his voice swelling like thunder, his daughter weeping, in silence behind shuttered windows. Each stroke was meant to break the man, to remind him of chains stronger than iron. Yet chains are not always visible. Some lie in silence, wrapped in humiliation, in pain endured before a crowd too frightened to intervene. And in that silence, something far more dangerous can grow. Even now, as embers hissed in the cooling night, the townfolk remembered his silence. Not a scream and a plea, not a single word as the leather cut deeper. Only the sound of the lash, the rush of blood, the faint moan of rope against wood. Silence mistaken for defeat. But silence is never empty. It is a waiting place, a harbor for thoughts that cannot yet surface. Some wounds do not close. They fester, they seethe, and they search for release, and when release comes, it does not whisper. It roars. The Reverend's house was gone, consumed in less than an hour, but the fire had been lit long before. Not in the hearth, not in the walls, but in the marrow of a man who had been broken, humiliated, left to rot, and who chose instead to answer pain with flame. The crowd stared at ruins and tried to name it God's wrath. Yet deep down, each of them knew. Flames never rise without fuel, and rage never dies without reckoning. And this reckoning had only just begun. Mississippi, late 1840s. A land heavy with silence and sound all at once. By day, the heat pressed down like a weight, thick and unrelenting. The swamps buzzed with cicadas and mosquitoes, their hum rising and falling like a living chorus. By night, fog rolled across the lowlands, settling in pale sheets that clung to the ground, making the cotton fields look like graveyards under a ghostly shroud. In this place, time was measured not by the turning of clocks, but by the tolling of church bells, morning prayer, midday sermon, evening hymn, each note carrying across the delta like a chain reminding everyone of their place. At the center of this world stood the Reverend, tall, gaunt, and severe. He carried himself with the certainty of a man convinced that God himself had entrusted him with dominion. His voice filled the pulpit with fire, warning of sin and eternal damnation, while his eyes searched for weakness. Among his flock, to the town he was a figure of respect, a man whose word carried weight, whose reputation defined order. But behind the whitewashed walls of his home, piety was less a virtue than a weapon, wielded to silence, to control, to bend others beneath his will. His daughter lived in the shadow of that authority, pale from being kept indoors, delicate from a life designed to protect appearances rather than nourish spirit. She seemed a porcelain figure placed upon a shelf. Yet, Beneath that fragility stirred a quiet hunger for something her father's sermons could not provide, for warmth in a house chilled by judgment. She longed not for grandeur, but for tenderness. In the enslaved man, she found it. His presence carried a gravity that needed no words. He worked with strength, his hands shaping wood, mending tools, coaxing order from the chaos of the land. Among the enslaved, he was respected for his calm endurance. His quiet defiance, though chains still marked every step he took. To her, he was more than labor. He was a heartbeat in a place where everything else seemed cold. Their bond did not erupt suddenly but grew in shadows, in moments stolen from the watchful eye of the Reverend. A glance exchanged while passing through the hall. The brush of fingers when handing over a pitcher of water. Whispers shared in the stillness of night when the household slept, cicadas droning like witnesses outside the window. It was fragile, yes, but within it lay rebellion, not shouted from rooftops, but whispered against the silence of oppression, and in that whisper, danger was born. Because in this land, every bond had a price. The Reverend demanded purity from his daughter and obedience from his slaves, and to see those lines crossed was an insult he could not bear. Reputation was his altar, and he sacrificed ruthlessly to protect it. In sermons, he thundered against the sins of others, but within his home, his greatest fear was exposure not of faith, but of control slipping from his grasp. Even the land seemed to reflect these contradictions. Cypress trees stood like sentinels, their roots sunk deep into black water. Cotton stretched across fields, white and endless, yet its softness was born from blood and broken backs. On Sundays, townsfolk filled pews in their finest dress, voices raised in hymns. But when the doors closed and the hymnal shut, the lash cracked in the fields, and prayers gave way to screams swallowed by swamp air. For the enslaved man and the Reverend's daughter, each moment of closeness carried the weight of inevitability. Their bond was not only tenderness, but defiance, a quiet declaration that the chains of custom could be crossed. And, like all things fragile, it could not remain hidden forever. When her secret began to show, the world around them shifted. Whispers became louder than cicadas, heavier than bells. The Reverend's fury stirred, coiled tight like a serpent waiting to strike. And strike he would. The secret could not stay hidden. By midsummer, her body betrayed what whispers had already suggested. Dresses could no longer disguise the swell, and eyes in town began to linger too long on the Reverend's daughter when she passed. What began? As murmurs behind lace fans and over fence rails soon swelled into a storm. The church pews buzzed with speculation, each tongue sharpening the tale. The Reverend's own daughter carrying the child of a slave. Shame moved faster than fire, spreading across the parish until every porch and every storefront echoed with it. To the Reverend, it was not the sin that seared him, it was the threat to his name. His sermons had thundered about purity, about the sanctity of his household as a reflection of divine order. Now, all he saw was ridicule waiting in every corner, a congregation ready to question his authority. Reputation was his altar, and he would sacrifice his daughter, his slave, and his very soul upon it to protect his standing. On a sweltering evening, he summoned the enslaved man. The air was thick, unmoving, the cicadas droning as if to mark the gravity of what was about to unfold. A post had been planted in the dirt, rough rope already coiled at its base. The crowd gathered, their faces hard but their eyes restless, for they knew what was coming. Some came to watch, some to reassure themselves that order still ruled the land, others out of fear of being absent when such judgment was rendered. The man was stripped, his back exposed to the heat of the setting sun. His wrists were bound to the post, rope grinding into skin. The Reverend stood before him, Bible in one hand, whip in the other. He prayed aloud, each word booming like a hammer striking iron, his voice trembling with rehearsed conviction. But as the prayer ended, silence fell. The only sound was the faint rustle of insects in the grass, and then the first crack split the air. It sounded like a pistol shot, sharp and merciless, followed by the hiss of leather snapping back. The man's flesh opened under the strike, blood seeping in thin lines down his spine. A second lash followed, then a third. Each crack tore through. The humid night, mingling with the stifled sobs of the Reverend's daughter, who watched from the shadows of a shuttered window. The iron tang of blood thickened in the air. Dust clung to sweat, and the smell of raw flesh rose with every lash. Still, the man did not scream. He did not plead. His silence pressed heavier than thunderclouds, unsettling those who came expecting the cries of the broken. Children flinched. Women turned their heads, but the Reverend's arm did not slow. He whipped until his own breath came ragged, until sweat dripped from his brow onto the dirt below. When at last he paused, the ground beneath the post was slick, the man's body a canvas of welts and open wounds. The Reverend declared it done, his voice hoarse yet triumphant, insisting that order had been restored, and God's will upheld. The crowd dispersed slowly, whispering again, though their whispers had changed. For while the lash had cut deep, the silence of the man remained, and silence unsettled them more than screams ever could. They left convinced the will of God had been carried out. But in the quiet that followed, something darker took root. The enslaved man hung limp against the post, breath shallow, blood dripping into the earth. Yet within the haze of pain, a different fire smoldered. He had been whipped to satisfy pride, not justice, humiliated to preserve reputation, not righteousness. That knowledge burned hotter than the pain itself. And pain, when stoked, becomes fuel. The Reverend's sermons had long spoken of fire and brimstone, of eternal damnation waiting for sinners. He had wielded fear like a weapon, painting visions of burning pits and unending torment. But as the enslaved man's wounds cooled in the night air, his silence shifted. It was no longer the silence of endurance, it was the silence of resolve. The crowd went home believing the story had ended. But stories like this never end with the crack of a whip. They end with the hiss of kindling, the roar of flames, and the cries of those who once believed themselves untouchable. And the Reverend, for all his sermons, had not yet learned what true damnation sounded like. The night was moonless, the kind of darkness that seemed to erase the world rather than cover it. No stars lingered overhead, as if the heavens themselves refused to bear witness. The fields lay still beneath a cloak of heavy summer heat, every blade of grass damp with the weight of waiting. Cicadas hummed their endless dirge, a low, metallic chorus that seemed to tremble with anticipation. At the tree line, he stood bare feet pressed into the earth, breath steady, eyes fixed on the house that had broken his body and tried to crush his spirit. For weeks he had prepared, watching the rhythms of the household. The Reverend prayed late into the night, pacing floors that creaked like old bones. The daughter, pale and silent, carried her shame like a shadow she could not outrun. Servants moved cautiously, their faces drawn tight with fear of what violence might come next. And he watched, learned, and waited for the hour when silence would work in his favor. His plan was not born of sudden rage. It was the seed planted in pain, watered by every lash, and grown tall in the soil of humiliation. Tonight, it bore fruit. The tools of vengeance were simple stolen scraps of cloth, soaked in lamp oil, resin pulled from pine, a flint hidden carefully in the fold of his trousers. Nothing grand, nothing elaborate, just enough to speak the language of fire. He carried them now, tucked close to his chest, as though holding the last fragments of his own will. The Reverend's house loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the night. Its timbers were rich with age, resin, and sap locked in the beams, eager for the kiss of flame. Oil lamps burned faintly inside, their yellow glow seeping through warped shutters, spilling thin lines of light across the porch. The smell of wood, dry and waiting, mingled with the faint trace of kerosene that clung to the rags in his hands. He moved with care, each step a whisper against the packed earth. At the edge of the porch, he paused, listening. The house breathed with muffled sounds. A cough from the Reverend's bedchamber, The restless turning of a woman lost in thought, the faint whimper of a child in uneasy sleep. Ordinary sounds of life, sounds that, within the hour, would twist into something else. He pressed the oiled cloth to the base of the wall, the timber cool and smooth under his touch. The flint sparked once, twice, then caught. A thread of flame licked upward, tentative, like a tongue testing its freedom. He stepped back, feeding the fire with another rag, then another, until the sparks grew teeth and bit into the wood. At first, the house seemed to sigh. A low groan as heat seeped into its bones. Then the fire leapt, quick and greedy, climbing the walls with the fury of something long imprisoned. It raced along beams, clawed at shutters, and sent shadows flailing. Across the yard like spirits dragged from the pit. Smoke curled skyward, thick and acrid, carrying with it the bitter perfume of sap and tar. The Reverend woke first. His bellow carried through the night, ragged and furious, words tangled in half-formed prayers. His daughter's scream followed, shrill and terrified, breaking into sobs as she stumbled through the choking haze. Servants shouted, doors slammed. Feet pounded against the floors that no longer held steady beneath them. The fire roared louder, drowning their voices, devouring timber, window glass, cloth, and flesh alike. The enslaved man did not move. He stood at the edge of the yard, the inferno reflected in his eyes, his face carved from stone. There was no triumph in his expression, no glee at the chaos, only grim inevitability, as though the fire were not. His doing but the hand of justice itself delivered through him. Sparks burst upward, showering the sky with embers that glowed like fragments of fallen stars. The heat rolled outward, pressing against his skin, searing the edges of his resolve, but not driving him back. He could hear every sound glass shattering, beams splitting, voices crying out in terror. Each scream was swallowed by the crackle of fire, each plea turned to ash before reaching the heavens. For those who watched from a distance, slaves. Roused from nearby quarters, neighbors drawn by the glow, the sight was both dreadful and mesmerizing. The Reverend's house, once a monument to his authority, now collapsed inward like a dying beast. Its flames licked the night sky, a pyre for reputation, power, and the cruelty it had sheltered. Some crossed themselves, whispering prayers. Others stayed silent, knowing the prayers had come too late. And still he did not flee. His body bore the memory of whips, his back a map of scars, and tonight, the fire wrote the final chapter of that suffering. He remained in place until the roof caved in with a thunderous crash, sending a pillar of sparks into the dark. Only then did he turn away, not hurried, not afraid, but steady, his steps guided by the glow behind him, the light of justice consuming all that once held dominion over his life. Justice had spoken in the language of fire, and the night carried its message far beyond the Reverend's land. But the quiet did not last, for when the embers cooled and the smoke curled into the heavens, the world would begin to ask what kind of man could commit such an act, and what kind of world had made inevitable. By dawn, the Reverend's house was no more, where proud timbers had once stood. Only smoldering beams jutted upward like broken ribs, smoke rising in thin, bitter columns. The air was heavy with the stench of ruin-burnt timber, scorched fabric, and the unmistakable sweetness of charred flesh. Ash drifted lazily in the humid morning air, clinging to faces and clothing, coating every surface as though the fire had painted the world in gray. Villagers gathered in silence, feet pressing into damp earth, eyes locked on the ruin that had once been a place of prayer, power, and punishment. Mothers drew children close, pressing hands over small mouths to keep them from asking questions that had no safe answers. Men stood with arms folded, their gazes darting from the wreckage to the swamps beyond, searching for meaning in the smoke. Some muttered of God's judgment, others of the devil's triumph, but none spoke with certainty. The truth, like the fire, was too large to be contained by words. Among the enslaved, the reaction was quieter still. No laughter, no cheers, no visible joy, but a silence charged with something deeper, sharper. Eyes lingered on the ashes with a strange mix of fear and reverence. What had been unthinkable had been done. One of their own had defied the order of the world, answering brutality with flame. No overseer dared say it, but in every whispered glance there pulsed a quiet recognition. Someone had spoken for them in the only way left, and yet the man himself was nowhere to be found. His name slipped into rumor, his body into uncertainty. Some swore he had fled into the swamps, moving like a shadow through cypress groves and curtains of mist, where dog and man alike could never follow. Others whispered he had been seized in the night, beaten until silence reclaimed him, his bones buried in some shallow grave that would never be marked. A few claimed he had not survived the fire at all, that he had walked into it willingly, vanishing in the same flames that devoured the Reverend's legacy. No account was ever confirmed, only the smoke remained, and with it the uneasy truth that he could be anywhere, or nowhere at all. The Reverend's voice was gone forever. His sermons, once shouted with fury from the pulpit, had ended in smoke and screams. Where he had demanded obedience, there was now only silence. His legacy, his reputation, his home lay reduced to cinders. Even his daughter, once hidden behind whispers of purity, now lived in the open shame of survival. Her cries, from that night echoing louder than any hymn. Every time the wind shifted and carried the scent of char from the ruins, the congregation remembered. The man who had preached fire and brimstone had been consumed by them both. The land itself seemed changed. In the days that followed, no bird sang near the blackened foundation. The cicadas that had once screamed into the night fell quiet in its shadow. Even the grass grew reluctantly, as though the earth had swallowed the memory of fire and found it too heavy to release. At dusk, the ruins glowed faintly, the embers refusing to die, as if determined to remind all who passed that the night was not forgotten, and those who lived through it carried the memory like a weight in their chest. Parents hushed their children when they asked about the fire, but children kept asking. Farmers looked over their shoulders at night, half expecting to see a figure in the fields, eyes lit by reflected flame. And the enslaved, walking in the same rows of cotton and cane, felt both fear and strength in the silence left behind. The fire was gone, but its shadow remained, long and unyielding. And yet, the quiet did not mean peace, for when a story spreads without end, when it lingers in whispers and smoke, it does not fade. It grows. Time does not always erase. Sometimes it distills, leaving behind only what refuses to die. So it was with the fire of 1849, long after the ash had been carried off by rain, long after the ruins were swallowed by weeds and roots. The story remained passed from mouth to ear, whispered in kitchens and fields, carried by those who knew that silence does not mean surrender. The Reverend's name, once spoken with authority, became a caution instead. His sermons, once booming from pulpits, were remembered not for scripture, but for the screams that ended them. His family line withered in memory, reduced to shadows. At the edge of firelight, what endured instead was the act, the blaze that turned the house of sanctity into a pyre. Was it justice? Was it tragedy? Perhaps it was both. A punishment that consumed not only a man of cruelty, but every soul beneath his roof. Yet in the cruel balance of that world, where lashes fell for lesser sins, who could say the fire was not inevitable? The enslaved man himself never appeared in ledgers, never had his story written in any book. He was marked only by absence, by the gap he left in records, by the nameless figure haunting rumor, and perhaps that anonymity was its own kind of freedom. In time, he became not one man, but many, a vessel for all the voices crushed into silence, a symbol of the fury that cannot be erased. Even today, in the oral traditions of the South, his story lingers like smoke, rising through generations, never entirely dispersing. They say the land itself remembers. That near the place where the Reverend's home once stood, the air grows warmer when night falls, though no fire burns. The cicadas hush, the crickets fall still, and for a moment The silence thickens until it feels alive. Some claim may hear faint crackling in the distance, as though wood is burning just out of sight. Others insist they have caught whispers carried on the wind, voices low and mournful, or a single breath drawn steady in the dark. No one stays long enough to be certain. Folklore has its own weight, its own truth, and whether you believe in ghosts or not, the story of that fire has endured far longer than the Reverend's sermons, far longer than the cotton I once grew. In the fields, far longer than the names of those who whispered in fear the morning after. It remains because it is not only the story of one man and one night, it is the story of every silent act of defiance, every ember smoldering beneath oppression, every moment when suffering becomes too heavy to bear. The fire has died. The house has fallen, but the echo remains, carried through time like a wound that never fully heals. So ask yourself, when the land grows quiet, when the air feels heavy, when the night seems to breathe, are you hearing only silence? Or are you hearing the fire still burning,